Greetings and welcome to another special edition of Slant Alpha Adventures. In this video we'll cover a very basic overview of air traffic control communications geared especially for the VATSIM network. It's based on real-world ATC communication procedures, but some of what we cover here is specific to VATSIM. And remember, I'm not a real-world pilot, I just play one on Twitch TV. Two-way radio communication in safety-sensitive environments almost always uses a set vocabulary because misunderstandings can have fatal consequences. So, first off, did you ever notice that in the English alphabet, the letters B, C, D, E, G, P, T, V, and Z all rhyme? And that's not all, because A, J, and K all sound similar, and F and S are very easily misheard from one another, and M and N, same thing, and the list goes on. So, to protect ourselves against mishearing one call sign for another, aviators use this substitution table to represent letters. Now you're asking, why do we have to use a specific set? Why can't we just use any word that pops into our head? Well, without a standard set, there's still lots of opportunities to mishear each other. For example, did you say Ryan or Brian? Did you say Don or John? Did you say Mickey or Nicky? And so forth and so on. So here are 26 words that can't really be mistaken for one another, at least not easily so. There's no magic formula for knowing these, you just have to memorize them. I kind of recommend that as you're walking around in your daily life, practice reading out signs letter by letter as you go around. And if you're not mistaken for, like a crazy person, then the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll get with them. With numbers, we tend to read those out digit by digit most of the time. So 250 will become 250 and so forth. Because otherwise, 250 and 260 might easily be misheard from one another. In the US, one usual exception is within airline flight numbers. So, for example, it would be okay to say United 1355 rather than United 1355. One thing that we do to help 9 and 5 sound distinguishable from one another is we say the word niner in place of 9. Now, don't just add to the end of numbers because you think pilots do it to sound cool. I promise you, if you ever say fiver over the radio, I'll bet you a fiver the controller doesn't think you're cool. Now, side note, some people will tell you that the reason for the whole niner thing is so that it's not confused with nein, German for no. And, there might be something to that. Aviation language is, after all, international. However, I can't think of too many contexts where you'd be told a number with a 9 in it and misconstrue it as negative. So, to me, it just seems more likely that it's there so it won't be misheard as a 5, which happens all the time. So heading 250 versus heading 290 and so forth become very distinguishable from one another. So, you believe whichever story you like. Doesn't really matter. Anyway, so now you've got the basic lingo down. Let's talk about what a pilot says to a controller. The very biggest mouthful that a pilot has to spit out all at once is pretty much when you're checking in for the first time with a new controller. The good news is the flow of that is pretty much the same every time. Their call sign, your location, your altitude, both your current and what you're climbing or descending to, your intentions, and the current ATIS letter for the airspace that you're in. Think of it as, who am I talking to, who am I, where am I, how high up am I, what do I want, and what do I know? Now, there are certain situations where you can skip some of those, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. Before I get into some of the examples of a pilot check-in, though, I want to lay out the framework for the other kind of notoriously daunting piece, which is that initial clearance call. And this follows the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration format, so other parts of the world do it a little bit differently, but it's pretty close. The acronym that we use in the U.S. to remember the normal order for a clearance is CRAFT. Clearance limit, route, altitude, frequency, transponder. There you go. You good? You got it? Okay, good. We'll see you later. No, I'm just kidding. We'll go through some examples. It'll make a little more sense that way. Let's start with the flight that we're intending to do for our upcoming first GA Wings event, Raleigh-Durham International Airport to Norfolk International Airport. We covered the process of coming up with a route for this in a previous tutorial. So for this example, let's say we're flying at RNAV, so we're using the Herrick 3 to Tar River, then to Cofield, Drone, and Drone 2. And today we're going to be in a prop plane with 9,000 feet as our filed cruise altitude. Raleigh approach, Baron 514 Delta Victor's on the ground at Raleigh-Durham, IFR to Norfolk International with Foxtrot. You can say information Foxtrot if you like. I like to keep it concise. Don't say IFR to Norfolk as filed. We know you wanted this filed, that's why you filed it that way. Now, why do we add on the ground at Raleigh-Durham here? Well, in this example, we're getting our clearance from Raleigh approach. And on VATSIM, when there's not a delivery or a ground or a tower controller at a certain airport, the duties of all those positions will fall to the next highest controller in the hierarchy. So once you get to the point where you're calling approach or center, that one controller might well be covering multiple airports. So, for example, let's look at Atlanta. Atlanta approach might be taking clearance requests from Hartsfield International, but also from Cobb County, Dobbins, Fulton, DeKalb Peachtree, and Gwinnett as well. So it helps them out if you can tell them where on their scope to look for you so they can click on you and bring up your flight plan. That does mean, though, that if you're talking to a local controller at your origin airport, meaning a delivery, ground, or tower controller, you don't have to tell them what airport you're at. You might tell ground where you are on the field when you're ready to taxi, but for clearance purposes, they don't really need to know that, at least not in the U.S. Also, if there's not an ATIS running at your origin, which happens on VATSIM fairly frequently, normally you just pull a METAR observation for wind, cloud, and altimeter numbers, and instead of with Foxtrot, you can just say with the weather. Also, if you're getting your ATIS from an external non-VATSIM source, like your Active Sky or your default X-Plane or FSX simulation, the ATIS letter's not going to match up with anything the controller's seeing. You can just say with the weather. But that does save the controller from having to read out all of that information to you over the channel, so it does help them. So, are you ready to copy your IFR clearance? Well, you're not? Oh, you should be. Well, because here it comes. It's going to come fast, but since you know what order it's about to come in, that should make it easier for you. You can actually jot down some of these things ahead of time, pieces of information that you already know, so then you can focus on scribbling in the new information and then be ready to read it back all right away. Baron 514 Delta Victor, Raleigh delivery, cleared to Norfolk International Airport via Herrick 3 departure, Tar River transition, that is filed. Maintain 2000, expect 9,010 minutes after departure. Departure frequency 124.95, squawk 6501. And then you'd read all that back, preferably in the same order. Now, let's go over a couple possible variations, so hopefully you'll be ready for them if you hear them. First one, instead of maintain 2000, expect 9,010 minutes after departure, you might get climb via SID there. Now, at Raleigh, I don't think that's the case, but other places it might be. So, what's that mean? Well, let's look at the SID we filed, the standard instrument departure procedure. In this case, it's the Herrick 3, and lo and behold, it says right here, props, maintain 2000, expect filed cruise 10 minutes after departure. So, a SID is more than just a route. There's other instructions in there too. So when you file it, and then you accept the clearance on it, you're agreeing to follow those instructions. So it's helpful to know what those instructions tell you to do. Now, like I said, you might get that climb via SID some places. Generally at Raleigh, though, they'll read out the altitudes as part of your clearance, whether it's in the SID or not. Now, another minor variation that I'll point out, just in case you hear it, there's just a bit of a nuance to it, but it's probably important that you understand it and read it back properly. So let's say you're doing this with radio navigation only, Slant Alpha, and instead of the Herrick 3, you filed the Raleigh 9. So there's technically not a transition route on that. What you'll get is cleared via the Raleigh 9 departure, radar vectors Tar River, that is filed. And that's the way you should read that back. It basically means that you know you shouldn't turn toward Tar River until ATC gives you a heading. Alright, next variation. Let's fly this one VFR instead of IFR. In this case, we're not calling for clearance to our destination. VFR flights are cleared into Class Bravo airspace, which we'll touch on in a minute, but other than that, you really just need to state your direction of travel. Raleigh delivery, Baron 514 Delta Victor, VFR northeast bound departure with the weather. Now, the one thing that you can add here, optionally, is whether or not you want flight following. I kind of wish I had a chance to go deeper into what flight following really is, but unfortunately I get a little pressed for time getting this tutorial out, so we'll save that topic for a later video. But in simple terms, it's a service where even in Class Echo airspace, where VFR flights don't have to talk to ATC, they will stay in touch with you and they'll track your progress and give you traffic alerts and warn you about weather or terrain, and they can help you get pointed in the right direction if you lose track of your position. If you don't want that, you can specify that right here. Negative flight following. If you do, the information they need is your intended cruise altitude, your destination, your aircraft type, and your navigation equipment type. Navigation equipment's another good topic for another tutorial later on. But for now, if you're general aviation and you have GPS, you're Slant Golf. If you have only a VOR and ILS gauge with DME, you're Slant Alpha. The other option is don't specify here at all whether you want flight following, and they'll just ask you about it when you're about to exit the Class Charlie airspace. So, Raleigh delivery, bearing 514 Delta Victor VFR, northeastbound departure with the weather. At a Class Charlie, you don't need an explicit clearance to enter the airspace. Only two-way communication plus your Mode C transponder. So the response will skip a few of these items down here. All you'll get in this case is bearing 514 Delta Victor, Raleigh delivery, maintained VFR at or below 2000 until advised. Departure frequency 124.905, squawk 6501. At some Class Charlies, your initial clearance will include something for route, probably something simple like on departure, fly runway heading. And then if you're at a Class Bravo, even if you're VFR, like I mentioned before, you actually do need that word cleared. So you'll hear cleared out of the Raleigh Class Bravo airspace via fly runway heading, then the altitude, departure frequency, and squawk code. But, again, there's no Bravo airspace at Raleigh. That's just for the sake of an example. All right, let's switch gears now and talk about checking in with a controller when you're airborne. And let's assume that we're coming up on Norfolk approach, and either we haven't been talking to Washington Center because they're not online, or we've been doing this VFR without flight following. Whatever reason, we haven't been talking to them, and we're approaching Norfolk approach's airspace. So the good news is this follows the exact same format we've already been talking about. Norfolk approach, bearing 514 Delta Victor, 20 miles southwest of the field, descending through 7,500 for 3,500, inbound full stop with information Lima. Again, it's who are you, who am I, where am I, how high am I, what do I want, and what do I know? Now, let's say you did have flight following and you were talking to Washington Center and they handed you off to Norfolk approach. Anytime you're handed off from one controller to another, they've already talked about you kind of behind your back, and your new controller already knows where you are. So you can omit the location, but you still give the altitude. You're always going to give your altitude to a new controller to verify that your Mode C is still reporting properly and you have the altimeter set correctly. If you're IFR rather than VFR, my opinion is you can omit the intentions part too, because you filed that in your flight plan what you wanted to do, and you got cleared on it, and the controller has that information, so presumably they know your intent. I guess it's kind of less likely that an IFR flight will be looking for closed traffic and touch and goes, but that's just my take on it. You can say it if you want, but it's probably just assume that you're intending to land. Now, last one. Your IFR, you just departed out of Raleigh, and you just got handed off from Raleigh departure to Washington Center. Since you just got handed off, like I mentioned before, you can skip the position report. Your IFR, so again, your intentions are assumed. And now, you're not in any terminal airspace, i.e., you're not in a Class Charlie or a Class Bravo, so there's no ATC letter to report either. So what's left? Just call sign, altitude, altitude. Washington Center, bearing 514 Delta Victor, climbing through 4,800 for 9,000. Okay, so those are the major cases for pilot check-ins. Really quickly before we wrap up, let's cover two more short topics. First, readbacks. Pretty much any instruction you get, you read back what you were instructed to do. Whether that's an altitude, a heading, proceed direct to such and such point, whatever. Any instruction on the ground or in the air, just repeat it right back as you start to do it. What you don't need to read back are informational pieces, most commonly like wind speed and direction. Now, I've seen some differing opinions on whether you read back altimeter settings. I tend to do it typically, since it can affect vertical separation if you don't set it when you're given it. The key thing is, though, to always include your call sign in any acknowledgement. And usually it's the last thing you say, but it doesn't have to be at the end. It could be at the beginning or whatever. But the point is, pilots only answer Roger in the movies. In the real world, at a bare minimum, respond with your call sign. The last little thing I want to touch on is when you're asked to report something in sight. Normally that's nearby traffic, but for a visual approach or a VFR pattern entry, it might be the airport or the runway. The two official responses you have are either have it in sight or negative contact. Unofficially, though, I like to use looking as a response. A, because it's a bit more concise, and B, because negative contact just has this connotation like I looked once, I didn't see it, and gave up. So if I'm still looking, I'll say, looking for the field, 514 Delta Victor. What you don't want to say is, I don't have it in sight. 514 Delta Victor, I don't have it in sight. Because with your engines blasting in the background, or you talk real fast like I do, or whatever, the word don't might not come across real clearly, and then the last thing the controller heard you say was what? Have it in sight. Now, by the same token, I recommend you don't say, will report runway in sight, or will report traffic in sight. Again, with background noise on your end, background noise on their end, all they might hear is 514 Delta Victor, something, 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 runway in sight. That's the exact opposite of what you actually said. So forget those and just go with either looking or negative contact as a response if you don't see what they've asked you if you see. All right, well, that's it. That covers the basics. Obviously, there's a lot more to air traffic control communications, but hopefully this is just enough to get you comfortable where you can jump on VATSIM and give it a try. Now, mark my words, I strongly recommend that you make your first handful of flights in areas where there's air traffic control but not too many planes, because controllers are way more happy to slow things down and explain stuff when they're not stressed to the gills by the workload. All right? Best of luck to you. Feel free to ask questions in the comments or jump in on any of the Slant Alpha Adventure social media venues to ask for clarification or more information. We'll see you live on Twitch TV, and hopefully we'll see and hear you in the skies. Travel safely in your own adventures, and we'll talk to you soon.